As the presidential election year of 1936 approached, many people were pretty much banking that Roosevelt was going to win a second term based on the force of his popularity. He was just simply a well-respected, well-liked president by a large portion of the population. So now let's talk about the decline of the New Deal in the 1930s. Alf Landon. So we move into the elections of 1936 and 38, and then the second Franklin Roosevelt. But in the end, it was a landslide for Roosevelt. The Depression in America. Minorities in the Depression. Here's the big thing. The New Deal for women and then American culture popularity in the really 1930s did not translate into overwhelming congressional the cartoon elections for the Democrats. Just running along, just minding his business and going along. Anti-New Deal Democrats won seats in the off-year election of 1938, and it made Roosevelt appear somewhat impotent. It also highlighted a certain thing that was going on in the administration that is nice and congenial and easygoing as Franklin Roosevelt seemed to the public. There was a darker side to him. He was definitely one to purge those who disagreed with him and to purge opponents out of the cabinet, out of the administration, and try to put them out of Congress as well. Meanwhile, the Republican Party and the Southern Democrats begin to equate the New Deal with socialism. And one of the reasons why there is such a great deal of pushback by the Republicans against the New Deal is that they do not believe that this is the role of government, that government should not be participating so strongly in the lives of the American people. For the Southern Democrats, it's a little more insidious than that. And that is, they felt that the New Deal was giving unfair advantages or giving just simply too many advantages to African Americans and other minorities. And this was serving to undermine their power at home. They were seeing the federal government taking over powers from them, especially in the handing out of pork barrel monies for the New Deal. And in equating it with socialism, this is going to set a template moving forward from the 1930s into the 1940s and 50s, especially when it comes to the civil rights movement. When Roosevelt takes office in 1937 for his second term, he delivers the famous one-third speech, that one-third of the nation lives in poverty, one-third of the nation lives without a job, one-third of the nation is underemployed, one-third of the nation goes hungry every night. And this is a rallying cry to the American people. But Roosevelt runs into a buzzsaw, and it's a buzzsaw of his own creation. One of the biggest obstacles to the New Deal was the United States Supreme Court. That was packed with judges led by Charles Evans Hughes and others who were conservative and had been appointed by the Republican presidents Coolidge and Harding and Hoover. Roosevelt decided that it was time for the court to evolve, and which meant for him getting more of his appointees on the court. And so he tried to enter legislation in Congress that would expand the Supreme Court of the United States from 9 to 15. Now, the Supreme Court had been 9 justices since the early 1800s. Many people balked at this. They said this was an assault on tradition, this was an assault on constitutionalism, and public outcry sunk the initiative. And here's the real sad part for Roosevelt, that had he waited just a little bit longer, some of those justices would have either retired or they would eventually die. And he got to put his appointees on the court. Adding to this, in 1936 and 1937, the New Deal had not done all that it was supposed to do, and there was a recession. And in the midst of a depression, a recession is not a very good thing, which means that there were job layoffs again, there were prices frozen, vast unemployment again was hitting the nation. Just at the time when the nation really needed to grow, it fell back a little bit. Nonetheless, Roosevelt is able to push through some key legislation in Congress. He has the Fair Labor Standards Act passed, which establishes a national minimum wage, which is always a thing that is debated between Democrats and Republicans today. Those of you who get time and a half for overtime in your jobs, thank you to the New Deal. And there was a great deal of curtailment of child labor at this time. One of the justices that Roosevelt was able to appoint is Frank Murphy. Frank Murphy had served as Roosevelt's Attorney General, and now he was appointed Supreme Court Justice. Murphy takes as his personal cause civil rights, and he begins to start turning the court more and more toward the enforcement of the existing civil rights laws, which again gives cause for many of the Southern Democrats to become very worried and afraid and start to say once again that the New Deal, and now the Supreme Court Justice, was an activist judge trying to undermine their power. This graph shows the unemployment starting with the stock market crash in 1929 and to the point where Roosevelt was inaugurated president in 1933. And there you see the slow decline of unemployment through the New Deal recovery, and then the recession that hit in 1937, and then finally the beginning of World War II in 1939 in Europe, and then the United States entry into World War II at the end of 1940. One of the most loved shows on the radio that eventually made its way to television on December the 7th, George Burns and Gracie Allen. Burns and Allen. It was a situation comedy starring the great George Burns and his wife, Gracie Allen. This was the entertainment that many people in America sought during the Depression. And the entertainment that many people sought was entertainment to take their mind off of their troubles. And so they listened to people like Burns and Allen, the Marx Brothers, the Three Stooges. Sorry, had to do that. And the famous Amos and Andy program starring Amos. Howdy, Amos. And hello, Andy. And the Kingfisher, which is where Huey Long got his famous nickname from, and my favorite character in that whole thing, the voluptuous and very wise Sapphire. The Depression was about making do with what you had. This is one of the reasons why grandmother's closets and drawers were stuffed with old buttons and all those little scraps and pieces of everything. The Depression, of course, is marked by urban relief, the bread lines and soup kitchens. But there was a great deal of employment relief through the WPA, getting people to work. This was a very, very big deal for people to get work whenever they could, however they could.
So I said, well, flip a coin, and if it comes out heads, have your hair dyed.
And if it comes out tails, say goodnight, Gracie.
And so we say to you, good night, Gracie. You also had literature that reflected the Great Depression. Nothing better reflects the Great Depression than John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath. The story of the Joad family as they move from Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl to California and suffer the exploitation and the oppression of the economic downfall. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird tells the story of Macomb, a town where Scout and Jem and Boo Radley during the Depression. Studs Terkel, the great writer of Chicago, who would go on and live all the way up into the 1990s and write about a variety of topics. In sports, you had baseball, Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio. In boxing, you had Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, as they called him, in which many whites in the country were rooting against Joe Louis, as he fought Max Schmeling of Germany twice, and whites were rooting for Schmeling over Louis. Schmeling knocked out Louis in the first fight, and then Louis came back at Yankee Stadium and knocked out Schmeling in the second fight. Louis and Schmeling became friends after the war. And, in fact, Schmeling lent Joe Louis a great deal of money near the end of his life when he was down and out. Obviously, the John Steinbeck talks about the California migration that went on. And in times of great economic crisis, people do turn back to religion, and this is a period of religious revival. In the picture you see in the upper left is Leonard actually had a federal theater project underway. Milton, and it's not all in that order, but you know them better as Groucho, Chico, Harpo, and Gummo Marx. There is actually a fifth Marx brother named Zeppo Marx, who always played the straight man in the early movies, but then he was somewhat... There are George and Dave working for other famous on the radio and from the nation. We all know what you see here in the next picture as a full man George Burns starred in the movie Oh God, which he won an Academy Award. He was famous for appearing on the cover of Penthouse, smoking his big cigar, coming out on the Tonight Show. Died the second wave of urban migration that went on. And Jamie Sheridan, Latinos were living in the country and supposedly taking up resources. There was a big move to repatriate Latinos. One problem, of course, is many of the Latinos were American citizens themselves. Perhaps the worst miscarriage of justice there was the Scottsboro Nine. On March 25th, 1931, people were hoboing on a freight train traveling between Chattanooga and Memphis. There was an equal number of African Americans and Caucasians. And they saw an 18-year-old young man named Haywood Patterson on the train, and the white teenage boys tried to push him off the train, claiming that this was a white man's train. And, of course, a rock fight ensued. And the sheriff was called out to take up the honor of the humiliated white teenagers, and two white women got off the train and accused the black teenagers of rape. And the case was first heard in Scottsboro, Alabama, in 3 very rushed trials. The defendants received poor legal representation, if any. They were convicted of rape, all of them except for a 12-year-old boy. They were sentenced to death. Okay, the case was appealed by the NAACP and the Communist Party. The Alabama Supreme Court affirmed 7 of the 8 convictions. The cases were twice appealed to the United States Supreme Court. There you see the artist Diego Rivera, trials. And there you see The mural this time, in 1937, Margaret Mitchell came out with a book awarded the #1 bestseller there in the New York Times. Orson Welles, Scottsboro. I'm 23 years old in 1930. Some of the greatest figures in 1930. In the upper left, you see James Braddock. Wells is called Cinderella Man by Damon Runyon.